All right. Thank you for joining us, especially those of you joining us live. It is a beautiful day outside, and we're very pleased that you chose to spend some time with us. I'm Cassandra Brown. I am the program manager for the OFFER program. That's the organic program at Ohio State, and we are housed in Worcester. Actually, we're mostly working from home still, but hopefully that changes soon. So we have with us today Doug Doohan, and if you haven't seen his February 3rd talk about controlling perennials, I would advise you to check that out. He kind of talks about Canada thistle and how to control other perennials. But today we're going to focus on annual weeds. So I believe he starts out with a little bit of a review, but Dr. Doohan is the manager of the OARDC Weed Lab, where he's been for several years, and was also a former coordinator of the OFFER program here in Worcester as well. So if you haven't filled out the poll yet, please do. I'm going to shut that off here in a minute. Looks like we got quite a few organic growers and a couple people that are either transitioning or curious about moving towards organic production. So that's great. Weed control is, of course, one of those big topics that you really need to master if you're moving to organic production, or try to master. So if you have a question while we're going through here, feel free to put it in the chat. We can also pause and take questions while we're presenting, but just be respectful to the presenter and keep yourself on mute. We don't want a lot of background noise during the presentation. So that's about it. And if you called in and you need to unmute yourself, if I put you on mute and you need to take that off, the control for that is *6. And I think that's about all I have to say here in the beginning. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug.
And Cassie, you're going to put the presentation up and make sure we have all our controls working, and we should be ready to go. And now you have gone muted, Cassie.
Sorry, I had to turn off the poll. Do you want to see the results?
I thought, yeah, I sort of, great. Okay, good stuff.
Okay, so that's who's with us.
Okay.
All right, and do you have any sound in your presentation?
No.
Okay.
No sound, no videos.
All right, should be good to go there.
Okay, so we're full screen now, and let's just see, we got our controls working. Get this out of the way. Well, good morning, everyone. So this is our second presentation on weed management in organic crops, and I'm still fussing just a little bit with control features. Okay, I think I need to have my mouse hovering over a certain spot in order to advance. So, okay, Cassie, this was working. Okay, it looks like it's gonna work. Key points from previous talk. I don't know why this is animated, but it is. It wasn't meant to be. So one of the topics that we talked about were the generally quite low efficacy of the methods of control that you can use in organic agriculture. And for anybody who's familiar with hoeing a garden, hand weeding, you understand what I mean by that. But you know, there's a scientific basis for that, and there's scientific data on it. We also talked about the value of using gangs of tools with your tractor drawn equipment. And by putting together, say, S-tines or tines with finger weeders, or rolling cultivators with finger weeders, or some other mechanical device, in a gang setup, there's quite strong data showing that you can actually improve the level of control that you receive in a single pass compared to having just one implement in a single pass. We talked about the importance of timing being everything. And we also talked some, and we'll spend more time on this today, about the importance of preventing seed rain. So let's see. Just a few thoughts on stacking efficacy. And this is data from University of Maine, from Eric Gallant's lab. And what it is showing is on the horizontal axis, you have the number of tools that were used in a single pass. So gang or no gang. And in fact, a gang of up to 3 tools in a single pass. With percent efficacy, in other words, the percent weed kill with these cultivating devices from these different passes. And so this is showing us that with just a single tool in this particular experiment, the average efficacy was only 40%. So if you're a farmer and that's the level of efficacy you're getting, you're going to be pretty disappointed with that. The range, so this is actually more than one experiment. I kind of misspoke there, showing that in the worst case scenario, there was hardly any efficacy. And in the best case, it was about 80%, but the average is about 35. With 2 tools, they raised the average to over 50. And with 3 tools in a single pass, they got, as high as 100%, still as low as 40, but the average of about 75%. So the number of tools that you're using can make a difference, and you can actually buy equipment that's set up to do that for you today. Keep in mind that maybe the main thing that this slide is illustrating, though, is the generally low efficacy of cultivation as a weed control technique compared to techniques that conventional farmers use, for instance, in other words, herbicides. And then we also talked about, and I mentioned that timing is really everything. And generally speaking, we would say that you want to cultivate when you are somewhere between the white thread stage, which is, in a sense, before emergence occurs, up to about the first true leaf stage. And we have weeds in the cotyledon stage here on the left. And then this is another one of Eric Gallant's slides showing the difference between lamb's quarters and pigweed seedlings at the 1 leaf stage, and hemp nettle and wild mustard seedlings also at the 1 true leaf stage. And it doesn't take very much imagination to understand that it's going to take quite a bit more effort and energy and turning of the soil to uproot and kill these 1 leaf seedlings compared to these 1 leaf seedlings. So timing is everything, but what we mean by the right timing varies depending on the species. So we also spent a lot of time talking about Canada thistle control in our last presentation. And when it comes to Canada thistle control in organic, and actually this is almost equally true for conventional farmers, crop rotation and the use of pasture and hay crops, in particular perennial crops, is really important if you're dealing with a Canada thistle infestation that you want to get under control. And that involves timely mowing, really. So the key is that you have high competition from the forage crop, and you're mowing periodically, which mowing really under those conditions will really suppress and set Canada thistle back enough so that in a couple of years you can largely eliminate Canada thistle from a field. The second point that we talked about, the second approach that we talked about, was the importance of competitive annual smother crops established at the right time. So in organic, we have made use of annual crops, smother crops, to choke out thistle and other perennial weeds. And of course, buckwheat, cultivated buckwheat, is one of the most common crops that's used to choke out perennials, thistle in particular. But in experiment after experiment, it's proven to be one of the least effective ways to approach Canada thistle in particular, and in contrast to sorghum and sorghum Sudan grass as being super competitive with thistle, and really, when used correctly, having quite an impact. And by establishing these crops at the right time, we're really talking about not doing this first thing in the spring, but probably allowing a thistle infestation to grow a little bit, grow up until it's about 6 to 8 inches tall, and then terminating it, plowing or whatever, and then establishing that cover crop. And the reason that is important is because of what's known as the compensation point. Coming out of the winter, Canada thistle rootstocks, underground rootstocks, are at their strongest, most robust form, and we want to let them grow for a while to deplete the carbohydrate reserves that are in those rootstocks before before we knock that, before we establish that smother crop, so that we have exhausted some of those carbohydrates, and that sets us up for a better result overall. That happens to be referred to as the compensation point, when the carbohydrates are at their lowest level. Okay, so this morning we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about giant ragweed control. And a few things about giant ragweed that are relevant is giant ragweed was not historically a problem. It was very rare for it to be an established and a serious weed problem on farms. It's a riparian species that always was down on the riverbank and on the stream banks. And what's happened is it's adapted to our farming practices. We've created some good sites for it, so it moved up into our field. So I'm getting some pretty serious feedback. Is anybody else, Cassie, are you noticing that? It's probably somebody.
Someone was unmuted. I took care of it.
Okay, so great. So yeah, so it's moved up into our field. Some things that we need to know about ragweed. First of all, earlier I'd mentioned the importance of timing with respect to cultivation, and the fact that timing is not going to be the same for all weed seedlings. And this gets really problematic with giant ragweed, because giant ragweed can germinate from as deep as 4 inches in the soil and emerge and develop a seedling. So, do you think you're going to be able to uproot a giant ragweed seedling that its point of germination was 4 inches deep? It's going to take some pretty impressive tools to get down and do that. That creates a real problem for us. In a cropping situation, giant ragweed is probably going to produce 700 or 800, maybe 1,500, maybe even 2,000 seeds per plant. It's not a terribly prolific seed producer, but those are not trivial numbers. 1,000 seeds per plant means that if you start out with 1 this year, you have 1,000 potential plants next year. So still not something to be fooled about. And another feature of giant ragweed is that it has these enormous seeds. These are so the seed size and the nutrition that's stored in those seeds makes giant ragweed seeds a very attractive food source for various vertebrate and invertebrate pests that are on the soil surface. Some of them even consider giant ragweed seeds to be ambrosia. That's an important clue for us, because first of all, I shouldn't say first of all, the clue is that maybe it's not a good idea to deep plow and to turn the soil over when you've got a giant ragweed problem. For one thing, you don't necessarily want to put those seeds that end up on the soil at the end of the year 4 inches down or 6 inches down in the soil, because they can grow from that depth. And we do know that burying them increases their likelihood of staying dormant and persisting for many years. So you may be perpetuating the problem by turning the soil over and burying them. Secondly, if we leave these huge seeds on the soil, research on the soil surface in the fall, research has shown that up to 90% of those seeds can be consumed by mice and by various insects before the following spring comes around. So just some tips from the biology of the species itself that can tell us a lot about how to manage it better. So what we're dealing with now in our fields is a riparian species that has become adapted to row crop farming. So if you read about giant ragweed, you will usually read that it's an early to mid-spring germinating species, and that it has a fairly narrow period of time within which it will germinate and emerge in the field. And here we're looking at some data from Iowa, from Ohio, and from an Iowa floodplain. Now, the history of giant ragweed movement into farm fields and becoming a problem in farms has been one that has kind of spread from the eastern corn belt to the western corn belt. So we've had a problem with it in Ohio for much longer than they have had a problem with it in Iowa. And we see this transition from the east to the west kind of reflected in the data on date of emergence in Ohio fields compared to Iowa fields. So here's a field in an infested ragweed field in Ohio. And this work was done maybe 10 or 12 years ago. These dates, you really can't read them very well on the horizontal axis, but this is basically April through the end of May, or in this case, this actually goes on into July, I believe. So April, May, June, maybe the 1st of July. And then the number of seedlings that came up at these different times when they were taking the data are reflected here on the vertical axes. So what I hope you're seeing is that emergence continued for much, much longer in Ohio than it did in either Iowa site. So here in Iowa, we have germination taking place over 3 or 4 weeks. In Ohio, we have it taking place over 8 or 9 weeks. That creates a huge problem, a much greater problem for when you try to control it, because you have to control it over and over again. And here's some data from plots from some of our research that we did here in Worcester at our West Badger farm a few years ago. And these are the NC and the C stand for no competition or competition, not particularly important for you today. But this is giant ragweed emergence. I just need to make sure that I'm telling you the right things here. Days after emergence. Well, I should have looked at this a little more carefully last night, because I'm not sure what this column actually means. But what I want you to see here is the emergence dates that we dealt with at our site at Worcester. We actually, at this site, we were not early enough to catch the earliest emergence, because ragweed will probably be germinating in the next few days, in March, if the weather stays like this. But we started recording data the 1st of May. This is when we first saw ragweed coming up in this particular set of plots. We were getting ragweed emerging in those same plots as late as August 28th. So if you're trying to control ragweed with cultivation over a period of time like this, it's almost an impossible task for you. So let's take a look at some additional data where we looked at the height of these same different cohorts of seedlings, and also their plant biomass that was produced. This is an important clue to us, because we've already seen that emergence can continue for a long period of time under our Ohio conditions with giant ragweed. But the height they really establish these true giants that can get to be 9 or 10 feet tall, mostly from those seedlings that emerge fairly early. So this is height on the vertical axis up to 200 centimeters, which is about 7 feet. And we see that these really tall plants are all coming from emergence of seedlings that took place by the end of May in this case. As we get into later and later emergence dates, 626, 79, the ones that germinated on 7/9 got pretty good. They got to be about 150 centimeters tall. But generally what we see is the tallest plants emerging quite early in May, and then with later emergence being less and less tall. So even though the plants that come up early, I want to rephrase this a little bit. Even though you can get a lot of emergence later in the season, they're going to be less competitive with the crop than those that emerge early and top the crop quickly. This is biomass, the weight of individual plants. So under no competition conditions, when the giant ragweed plants were growing individually by themselves, they were getting to weigh as much as about 3 or 4 pounds per individual plant after we had removed all the moisture from it. Under competitive conditions, they were a lot smaller. This 200 grams is about a half a pound. And here on June the 8th, we had some that were more than a pound. These are the red bars. But when we start getting out to these later emergent states, the plants don't get very big. They don't get very tall, and they don't get very big. Nevertheless, you probably are interested in controlling them, because what we see is that even these plants that are germinating in June, this is when it emerged, are still producing significant numbers of seeds. So here we have about roughly 400 seeds per plant being produced by giant ragweeds that germinated in late June, and under the non-competition conditions, a little bit more like 700 or 800. So you're not likely to get this, the 700 or 800 per plant from late emerging ragweed, but you are going to get a couple of hundred, and that's still significant and still something that's going to cause you a problem next year. And if you were to bury those seeds by inversion plowing, might cause you problems for a number of years. So in terms of the adaptation that giant ragweed has undergone as it has adapted to row crop farming, what we've seen is that we now have a population of giant ragweed in our state that is characterized by having continuous germination throughout the entire growing season. And that continuous germination means that your job of weed control for giant ragweed is never done. It just keeps coming and coming and coming and coming. And furthermore, the emergence from great depths also complicates physical weed control. You're going to have a great difficulty in controlling seeds that are germinating from seedlings that are germinating from 2 or 3 inches in the soil, no matter how early you get in and get those, because part of the root system is going to be still attached. They're still going to be buried in the soil. And those seedlings, even if you partially uproot them, are going to be likely to survive, much more likely to survive. So what's the, here's some reasons not to have giant ragweed, because it's one of the most competitive weeds that you're going to have to deal with. In fact, something that we found from Michigan State University the other day was saying that the weed agronomists at MSU were thinking the giant ragweed is probably the single most competitive weed problem that they have in their corn and soybean fields. And research has shown that if you're growing soybeans and you have giant ragweed in the field, you're going to lose somewhere between 45 and roughly 80% of your potential yield. And those are just reductions in yield that nobody can afford to have. No premium that you're going to get for growing organic is going to make up for those kind of yield losses. Corn, the situation is actually worse. In corn, ragweed that's not controlled from the beginning of the growing season can result in yield reductions of up to 90%. So the final bullet on this slide with the ET, that stands for economic threshold. Economic threshold is kind of an integrated pest management measure that you use to sort of estimate when the damage done by a pest, in this case giant ragweed, is greater than the cost of controlling that same pest. And in the case of giant ragweed, the economic threshold in corn was actually less than 1 plant per 20 square meters. So 20 square meters is roughly 200 square feet, if I'm doing my arithmetic correctly. Okay, so just imagine one giant ragweed, 200 square feet in your field. That's the cost of controlling, of going in and removing that weed is less than the impact, the negative impact it's going to have on your yield. So by all means, go in and control giant ragweed. And in particular, don't let it go to seed, because it's just a devastating weed when it comes to effects on yield. So some adaptive strategies for, just trying to check my time here, adaptive strategies for giant ragweed control. First of all, it's you want to have, if you've got a serious problem with it, you probably need to be considering having some form of very competitive cover down from early spring onward in those worst infected fields. And perennial forages in your rotation would be the best way to approach that. What you're trying to do is have something that's going to compete with and not allow those seedlings that emerge from early in the spring, probably through July in most situations, from emerging and producing more seed. And alfalfa is a really great way to do that. The cutting, the harvesting is part of the control, but it's the competition and the cover that's provided by the forages that really put giant ragweed at a disadvantage. Secondly, you want to prevent seed production or seed rain, no matter what. Like, you just can't afford to allow giant ragweed to go to seed, if particularly for organic. So giant ragweed's got this big seed, and it does get moved around in soil, just like other weed seeds get moved around in soil. So make sure that if you're, think of like if you have a field that's already infested and you're moving from that field to another field where you don't have giant ragweed, it probably makes sense to slow down long enough to clean the equipment before moving into that other field. A lot of giant ragweed will get harvested with corn and soybean, it will go through the combine and end up in the grain because it's not a lot smaller size than a soybean seed or a corn seed. Some of them can be just about as big. So a lot of that's going to come through and be in the harvested grain. If you're using that on your farm, or probably if you're selling it too, you may want to consider some way to decontaminate that grain. Hammer milling has been shown to reduce the viability of giant ragweed by about 99%. So that's a technique that you could use. It eliminates the concern about it passing through animals, for instance, and going back out on your field next year. You need to avoid fall tillage and soil and tillage. Fall tillage, first of all, it buries the seeds so that you're not going to have that up to 90% reduction in seeds that takes place over the winter from predation. So leave those on the soil surface over winter. Whatever you do, don't do soil inversion because that's going to bury them down and perpetuate the problem. And if you can leave some crop debris on the surface over winter, that will increase the likelihood that you're going to have effective predation because the cover protects the critters that are eating the seeds. If you are on an annual crop system, timely tillage in the spring, again, without soil inversion, is the key to knocking that seed bank back. So ideally, what you would want to do is encourage giant ragweed to germinate as much as possible before planting time comes along. For a real heavy infestation, you might consider doing that, maybe planting short season, late June, early July soybeans or something, where you can go in and use that stale seed bed, delayed seeding approach for a couple of months. And as long as you keep in mind that some of those seedlings are coming up from fairly deep in the soil and may have to ultimately be pulled out or something because you weren't able to uproot them, you should really be able to knock back your giant ragweed population by doing that. And if you're growing row crops, well, consider more narrow row spacings. More narrow row spacings have been shown to have an impact on giant ragweed competitiveness. And this is some data from Goplin et al. I'm not sure where they were working, but they looked at different crop rotations and the effect of those different crop rotations on both giant ragweed emergence within the different years of the crop, as well as the seed production that went back into the soil. So the rotations that they were looking at are kind of self-explanatory, but CC is continuous corn, SCC is soybean, corn, corn, CSC is corn, soybean, corn. You're getting the idea. Soybean, wheat, corn, and then soybean, alfalfa corn, and alfalfa corn. So when you look at emergence, you see that the soy corn rotation, at least during these first couple of years, had the largest number of seedlings that went up. So in the soybeans, there were 7 seedlings per square meter, per square yard. And then in the first year of corn, there were 10.5 seedlings per square yard. So you're looking probably at a 75, 85, 95%, 90% reduction in yield if those giant ragweed plants were allowed to continue producing. And I think they must have been pulling them out because you see when you get over here to year 3, regardless of what crop was grown, it happened to be corn every year, their emergence is pretty small actually, 1 or fewer per square yard by year 3. But the bigger picture, I think, is to look at what's going on over here in the seed bank, in the weed seed bank. And you see that by the time with the alfalfa system, you've eliminated 99% of the giant ragweed seeds that were buried in the soil by the end of the 4-year period of time, compared to only 90% in the corn, soybean, corn rotation. So you've got 10% more seeds roughly here, 8% more seeds roughly here in the corn, soybean, corn rotation than you do in the alfalfa corn rotation. So that's because The alfalfa is preventing ragweed from getting established. And I want to finish up just by saying a few words. Cassie just confirmed this for me, but I think it's just about time to wrap it up, right? It's 11:33. Have time for questions? Hope everybody hears me because Cassie's not responding.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. No problem. Yeah. So I just want to talk a little bit about zero seed rain. And we've done some of this work here in Ohio as well and kind of had similar results. But this is, again, some work from Eric Gallant at the University of Maine. And here you have germinating number of seeds, number of seeds per square meter taken from 10 centimeters deep in the soil, so about 4 inches deep in the soil. And the orange bars represent soil samples and the seeds in those soil samples taken from plots where the weeds were allowed to grow. And the yellow bars represent the number of seeds at the end of the growing season in soil samples taken from plots where there was no weed seed allowed to be produced and returned to the soil, okay? So basically they had 100% weed control all summer long in these plots. So after 1 year of doing this, there were almost 30,000 seeds per square meter in the plots where they didn't control the weeds, and there were almost down to just slightly more than half that many, slightly less than half that many in plots in soil from plots where the weeds were controlled all summer. Doing this for the second year, though, is where you really begin to see the impact. And in the second year of not letting any weeds go to seed on those plots, the buried weed seeds were approximately 90%, approximately only 10% of the number of weed seeds that were in those plots where the weeds were allowed to go to seed all summer. So this could be, think of this as your pristine vegetable plot where you have done an immaculate job of controlling weeds throughout the entire growing season. But this should also be your objective, whether you're growing vegetables or whether you're growing grain crops. If you've got giant ragweed, this is how you tackle it and how you get rid of it. In a couple of years, you can have a huge influence. So I think I'm just going to flip ahead to this kind of pretty slide that I have up here, and we'll stop at that point. Yeah, this again is giant ragweed growing where it's supposed to grow on the riverbank. I think this is a picture from somewhere in Texas. It looks a little bit warm, doesn't it? Okay, so that's what I have for you today, and we have, I think, about 10 minutes for questions.
Doug, you want to go ahead and unshare that? I think you have to do it now that
I would love to do that.
If you have a question, you can set it in the chat or you can unmute and just go ahead and ask it. And if nobody speaks up, I've got a few. All right. Nice. Doug, on that early slide you showed where they compared the 3 tools versus 1 tool or 2 tools. By tool on that, do you mean like a mechanical tool, or is that including like other like cultural techniques?
It's referring to some type of cultivation device.
Okay.
That's not to say that you couldn't use some combination of cultivation and flaming, for instance, although it doesn't seem logical to do that necessarily. So usually the stacking tools has involved use maybe of a finger weeder in combination with some kind of a C-tine or S-tine weeder, perhaps, and sweeps as well. I've seen that done. And this is where you get that increase in efficacy, and it's partly related to the fact that maybe those sweeps on the C-tines and S-tines do some uprooting, and then the finger weeders kind of throw the weeds a little bit, so they're not only kind of pulled up or loosened up in the root system, but then tossed horizontally by the fingers. So it's that type of different actions, the different motions in the soil that seems to make the difference.
I don't hear anyone else, so I'm going to keep asking.
Yes, it might be, one thing that we could ask, maybe someone would volunteer what their experience with giant ragweed has been. I know that, we do have some organic farms where giant ragweed has been just an enormous problem for them. And it's not a pretty picture, but yet I do think that it can be managed, it can be brought under control. So anyone out there with some specific experiences with giant, or for that matter, some other weed that you want to talk about? No, I see that Larry Phelan is on the call. Larry, you've worked it out on our badger farms over the years. Any thoughts or comments about your experiences with giant ragweed out there?
Well, just that it's a real pain. That's for sure. We we had a lot of difficulty with it, but I certainly would agree with you in terms of trying to get it cut down before it goes to seed. That's really critical. Now we did have some good experience when we were adding sawdust actually to the soil, and showed that we were able to suppress it to some degree by increasing the carbon. But yeah, it's a tough one. Biologically, and that's not what the farmers want to hear, but biologically, it's really quite interesting, just because of this flexibility that you see, like in leaf shape, in the height and everything. You would see different growth forms depending on how you're trying to manage it. So this makes it a real challenge.
Yeah, and it's kind of, thanks, Larry. And it's really kind of amazing when you think that all that diversity existed in those when it was kind of restricted to the riverbank. The diversity of biotype, growth habit, and the germination periodicity that we've talked about, it was all there. We had to get it up into our fields before that diversity began to really kind of become obvious and express itself. Kind of, weeds are one of my favorite sayings from a weed science paper that was written about 40 years ago is that weeds are the reciprocal of modern agriculture. And I think it really gets at a point, like if we weren't farming, we wouldn't be calling these plants weeds. They're actually important parts of the ecosystem.
Do you know, and maybe the farmers can help with this, looking at this from the outside, I'm not a weed ecologist, but it seemed like when I would be going, I was going to organic meetings a lot, and I never heard about this. And then all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or some, all of a sudden we just started seeing it everywhere. Is that your experience? Did it suddenly appear, or is that just my wrong impression?
I'm probably not the best person to answer it, and others please pitch in here. But I think it's a relatively recent phenomenon for giant ragweed to have become a major agronomic weed. It's very possible that in a sense we've released it. It's moved into our fields very slowly. And I was on an Amish farm in Holmes County. The first year I was in Ohio, 1998, and it was really interesting. They were growing vegetables, but they kept animals, and there was a path down to Sugar Creek, and that the cattle went down, and you could see where giant ragweed were growing where the cattle happened before. Giant foxtail and green foxtail were not agronomic weeds in the 50s and early 60s. We've kind of created the conditions that have allowed them to to emerge. And in the case of giant ragweed, and I would say it's true with foxtail too, it's not restricted to the use of, farmers who are using herbicides. There are problems for organic farmers as well. Sometimes we can say, well, that's because of your herbicide uses that you've got that weed. Don't think it's the case here. It's a more general adaptation. You get any questions or comments from the audience?
We've got a good question about using lightning weeders on ragweed. And I actually have, I don't know if it's going to work with my internet connection here, but I actually have like a little video clip. We tried let's see if this works. We tried lightning weeder, and you can see what happened there. He's showing it damaged the root, it damaged the stem, but then it kind of came back like a six-headed hydra and actually had more stems and seed heads than before. So we didn't have good luck with it, but I don't know. I'd be interested in what some other people found if they tried it. So.
I mean, that looks exactly what happens when you have herbicide-resistant giant ragweed. You kind of knock it back a little bit, and then it resprouts like a Christmas tree.
That's what we found. And
yeah.
What
do you mean by is?
Oh, go ahead. My connection's bad. Sorry, my connection's not good. Doug, if you asked a question, I missed it.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by a lightning zapper?
Yeah, so the lightning zapper kind of puts out an electronic pulse and it knocks back the weed. Supposedly kills it, but we did not find that.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is so there's I'm aware of one company from Germany that's really pushing these high voltage zappers, and I get emails from them all the time. But I don't think that those techniques are any more likely to kill big weeds, like the one you showed a picture of, than any other method would be to kill that weed. Try pulling that giant ragweed plant out by the root, and see how easy that is. All of these techniques, we talked a little bit about timing earlier. If you are not going after weeds when they are very small, you're going to fail. And you're going to fail repeatedly. I would say giant ragweed, it's quite likely that if you actually want to control it, you probably need to be doing your tillage, your pre-plant tillage. You probably want to be doing that before it's even out of the ground, and so, one way that you can, I haven't actually tried this, but I think it would work if you want to know when you should cultivate, when you should till for giant ragweed, go out and peg down a piece of clear polyethylene plastic over, a square yard or a couple of square yards in the middle of the field. The giant ragweed seedlings will come up out of the ground there where you put that plastic down a couple of days before they'll emerge from the soil. And when you see them emerging underneath that plastic, that's about the time you want to start getting the tillage equipment out and going after them, because you've got them at the thread stage in the rest of the field. That's arguably the best time to go after them, because if you get, I actually think at the cotyledon stage, you're going to get most of them. But if you get seedlings that are up there at the 2-3 leaf stage, you are not going to get them all unless you're using super aggressive tillage. And then you're just going to start burying some of those seeds that were on the surface to begin with. You want to kill them. You want to stimulate them to emerge. Very light, shallow tillage will encourage that. You want to knock those tiny seedlings out with light, shallow tillage. And you don't want to bury stuff that's on the surface. So again, light, shallow tillage is the way to keep them in that surface. Giant ragweed the seed bank of giant ragweed. Research has shown that it's got a seed bank persistence. So the persistence of buried seeds, really a couple of years. Most of them have either emerged or died. When you get out to about 4 years, we've taken them and buried them in the soil. When I say we, colleagues have, I haven't done it myself, buried them in the soil, and then look at the viability of those seeds that persist. By the time you get out about 4 years, about 90% of them have died. So, but the deeper you put them in the soil, the more persistent, the more likely they are to stay alive but dormant in the soil for a longer period of time. So by burying them, you kind of perpetuate the problem for yourself.
We had one other question on water hemlock, which I'm guessing has probably followed a similar pattern from creek beds and riparian zones to fields. So they say that this person's had to leave, but hopefully she can watch the recording here, and maybe some other people are having trouble with water hemlock.
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely see water hemlock, and it's created a lot of grief for some people in terms of, its nuisance factor. By nuisance factor, I'm referring to its toxicity, and I think there's some dermal toxicity involved there as well. I've not heard anybody talk about it being kind of an agronomic or even a horticultural crop weed problem. That doesn't mean that it couldn't be. And I would say that anybody who sees water hemlock starting to show up in their vegetable plots or in their row crops, you need to get very aggressive about not letting it go to seed. I don't know anything about its seed dormancy or persistence, but I'm absolutely certain that the seed are going to be dormant, because all wild seeds are dormant. So if it gets buried in your soil, you're going to see it coming back probably over several years. And I think, preventing seed production could be really important for you. It's a big, vigorous plant like giant ragweed is, so there's a good chance that it can germinate from fairly great depths. Yeah, so that would be my advice. Everybody's starting to feel like
Anyone else?
farming. The weather's so nice, right?
Yeah. Not me. I'm going to be on a computer, so.
Yeah, not me either.
Any last questions for Doug here before we break? All right. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thank you again for joining us, everyone. And next week we have Christine Sprunger joining us, and she's going to talk about what we found out by looking at soil health test results and comparing them to management practices, and see what's really moving the needle on building organic matter in soil. So that should be interesting. And
Jesse, can you and I stay on the call for just a moment?
Sure can. And there will be a recording on this posted later today, and we're doing that with all the sessions. So please check it out. All right.